Hello and welcome to NOAA's Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Shannon Lewinsky and I'm stepping in for Tracy Gill today as co-host of this NCA4 seminar series with Katie Reeves, who is the Engagement and Communications Lead at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Before we get started, I want to provide some seminar logistics, and then Katie will provide some background for this seminar series, share some information about today's seminar, and then introduce the speakers. But before she does that, here are some quick logistics. Today's seminar includes 2 presenters. There will be a short Q&A period after each presentation, so please place all questions in the chat box, and Katie will be monitoring that. If time permits at the end, we will allow for additional questions to be posed to both of the presenters. If you're interested in obtaining the recording of today's presentation, Katie will list relevant websites where that will be located in the chat box. And if you are not on NOAA's weekly science seminar email list but would like to be, you can email Tracy Gill, and I will put her email address into the chat box, and she'll add you to that list. So with that, Katie, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shannon, and thank you to NOAA for hosting the second installment of our webinar series focused on the findings of the 4th National Climate Assessment. As Shannon said, my name is Katie Reeves, and I'm the Engagement and Communications Lead for the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. The Global Change Research Act of 1990 mandates that USGCRP, quote, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. One way we do that is through the development of the Quadrennial National Climate Assessment. The 4th assessment was released in 2 volumes. The first, the Climate Science Special Report, was released in November of 2017 and covered in an earlier webinar series which can be found on our website, and I will include that link in the chat box. The second volume, Impacts, Risks, and Adaptation in the United States, is the focus of this series. As the title indicates, NCA4 Volume 2 assesses the observed and projected impacts of climate change across the U.S., covering 17 national-level topics and 10 regions. The assessment was released in November of 2018, and you can read and download it at nca2018.globalchange.gov, and I've already shared that link in the chat box with you. Today, I'm pleased to introduce 2 of our amazing authors, Upmanu Lall and Craig Zamuda, as they present on water and energy in a changing climate, findings from the 4th National Climate Assessment. Dr. Upmanu Lall is the director of the Columbia Water Center, the Alan and Carol Silverstein Professor of Engineering, and the chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering at Columbia University. He has broad interests in hydrology, climate dynamics, water resource systems analysis, risk management, and sustainability. Dr. Lall has been engaged in high-level public and scientific discussion through the media, the World Economic Forum, and with governments, foundations, development banks, and corporations interested in sustainability. He has served on several national and international panels and was one of the originators of the Consortium of Universities for the Advancement of Hydrologic Science. He is also a past president of the Natural Hazards Focus Group of the American Geophysical Union. Our second presenter, Dr. Craig Zamuda, is a senior policy advisor with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Policy, where he provides policy and technical advice on DOE programs related to energy sector vulnerabilities and resilience. He's provided leadership to public-private partnerships with electrical utilities focusing on characterizing critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, identifying and deploying cost-effective resilience activities and best practices, and addressing key research and policy opportunities. Dr. Zamuda has served as a lead author on numerous reports related to the energy sector and resilience, examining current and potential impacts of extreme weather and climate change on the energy sector and cost-effective resilient solutions to enhance preparedness and resilience. Thank you so much for joining us for today's NOAA Science Seminar. Over to you, Dr. Lall.
Okay, thanks very much for the very nice introduction and the setup. I'll try to get right into the talk. This talk was put together by a team, and I'll show you the names of the team at the end, but I'm presenting it on behalf of the group. We'll have 2 subsections in the talk. One is a presentation of what we did as the national summary chapter, and the second is some highlights from the regional sections of the National Climate Assessment Report. So to get right into it, the approach we took this particular year for the report was different from what people did in prior years. in the following way. In prior years, the water chapter, by and large, reproduced the typical storyline of what would be the potential climate impacts or the hydrological impacts of climate change and variability. And this year we wanted to actually look at it from the lens of water infrastructure and water systems. And so the summary that we have is encapsulated in these 4 points. The first is changes in the frequency and intensity of climate extremes are contributing to declining community and ecosystem resilience, but those changes are juxtaposed on a significantly deteriorating and aging water infrastructure of all sorts. This is dams and levees. These are urban water and wastewater systems. So it's the convolution of the climate risk and the aging infrastructure risk in the water sector that is to a great extent neglected in the discussion that we have had in the past that we wanted to highlight. The second is a similar story where we are talking about specific aspects of climate change, which are the frequency, duration, and geographic distribution of severe storms, floods, and droughts. And in the regional comments that I'll make, you'll see that there are specific regions where we are seeing droughts increase, and there are specific regions where we are seeing the floods and severe storms increase. And this particular year, actually, with the Midwest is a good example of the kind of things we are talking about. But again, we wanted to highlight that it's not just the climate change, but the fact that we have more people in coastal areas, and we have landscape changes that enhance the flooding potential with the same rainstorm that are of interest if we are actually trying to address these issues under adaptation strategies. The third point is that one of the things that got highlighted with the California drought over the last 5 years or so when we were working on the report, and the Texas drought and the Southeast drought prior to that, was that compared to projections for water use that were done in the 1970s, 1990s, and even as recently as 2010, our water use in the entire United States has been relatively flat. There are regional differences, but this has resulted largely from significant improvements in water conservation activities, both in urban areas and to an extent in agriculture. However, what that suggests is that if in the regions where we expect droughts to increase, the potential for achieving resilience by additional conservation may be limited relative to what has already happened. And so we have an exposure there that has to be dealt with. And finally, the large infrastructure that we have, dams and levees, the best way to portray that is with an example of the number of dams and the miles of levees we have. And I'll give you the example of dams. We have about 88,000 dams in the United States taller than 15 meters. And of those, around 2,000 some are owned by the federal government. The rest are largely owned by municipalities, private actors, and so forth. And the state of repair and maintenance of these is to an extent unknown. And that worries us quite a lot, because if we had even moderate climate extremes that led to the failure of these systems, then we would have other elements of critical infrastructure such as highways, power plants, and others that would be also exposed to cascading failure. And the national exposure to this risk is yet not assessed. So these are the things we wanted to highlight in our chapter this particular year. So as I work through, the framing was that, as has been pointed out in many other documents, in fact here the figures that you're looking at are from NOAA's NCA4 2018 document, the number of billion-dollar and higher disasters related to climate, and this would be storms as well as droughts and floods, has been increasing over time. Some of this is debated, but the evidence that is presented in these two figures is pretty much uncontested. So elaborating a bit further on the kind of things that we see, this is a large paragraph on one page, and I'm sorry for that. What we see are that there are significant changes in water availability and water quality across the country. These can be attributed to changing climate and to changing landscape and land use attributes. They impact both the human functioning as well as ecosystem services. And examples that are of concern are the variability in precipitation has been increasing. And in combination with rising temperature, we are intensifying droughts. This is the example that was put forth with California, where the decrease in rainfall was relatively modest, but with increasing temperatures, the impact in terms of water availability was more significant. Increasing heavy downpours, and this is established pretty well for sub-daily rainfall, but not for events that are of longer duration at this point. However, the persistence in rainfall as exhibited this year in the Midwest is also a concern. A fairly robust assessment is that the duration of snowpack has been reducing because of warmer temperatures, and the reduced snow to rain ratios change the timing of water supply and demand. So in the intermountain west and in the northern latitude, these are concerns for both flooding and for water availability later in the season. As we have seen increasing drought, what has happened is that the water use has shifted more towards groundwater than from surface water, especially during those periods, leading to consistent depletion in many regions, ranging from the Midwest to the West, but also in the proximity of urban areas across the country, including in the East. So the ability to meet drought needs from groundwater in the future will at least be compromised to the extent that the pumping cost will increase substantially. Finally, surface water quality is declining across the country as water temperatures increase and more pollutants are mobilized by high-intensity rainfall events. We've just finished an analysis that's not in this chapter, where we look at dissolved oxygen trends across the country. And what we see is that in the southeast, in particular, Florida and Texas and other areas, the dissolved oxygen levels consistently drop, and the relationship comes from warmer temperatures, which reduce the ability of oxygen to stay in the water, and also from increased microbial activity and algal activity, which consumes oxygen in water bodies. So from an ecosystem perspective, that's one of the factors that we are concerned about. The depletion picture is exhibited here. This is a picture from Bill Alley's paper. And what we see is that the decline that they show in groundwater in the 2001 to 2008 period actually is more significant than what we saw in the entire previous century. There are areas where there have been more or less declines, and the temporal variability of those declines relates also to the nature of precipitation variability in those regions. But it's a significant concern, especially in the regions that are highlighted for 2001-2008, California, the Ogallala, and the Arkansas region as well. The second message we had was that the deteriorating water infrastructure is a concern because we haven't really been investing in water infrastructure in the way that we did in the past. And while most of these investments happened in the 30s and in the post-Second World War period, with age, much of this infrastructure has deteriorated, and we have had, in fact, an order of magnitude decline in federal investment in these areas. That investment has shifted much more to local communities and states whose capacity is limited. And by and large, maintenance has been deferred in these areas, which gives significant concern as to how viable this infrastructure is, especially as we face more severe floods. We feel that this would be something that is a concern. Looking forward, we see that from a climate point of view, there is evidence that there is cyclical climate variability as well as anthropogenic climate change, which both together suggest that we need to think about which investments we should make when, because if we are in a phase where over the next 10 years we expect significant increases in drought risk versus flood risk, then we need to actually account for the direction of investment in that particular region. At the moment, our design principles for infrastructure, whether they are federal or local, assume that the past is representative of the future and look at a 30-year horizon without regard to the timing associated with possible events. or without regard to compound events or the persistence of multiple events. And so what we see is people talking about climate change as emphasized by the fact that in New Jersey, we had 500-year flooding events happen in 2 years, but that actually is an evidence of clustering or compound extremes. We have no design principles that actually address that at the moment. So that's something that needs to be taken care of. The third message that we had in the report, sorry, the thing seems to have vanished. Okay, here we go. It's similar, which is that as we look at the operation of infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, and so forth, and conjunctive use of surface and groundwater, our management strategies have been designed on rule-based systems where the rule is designed so that it is robust with regard to what we have seen in the past and doesn't take advantage of near-term forecasts or longer-term forecasts of the direction in which things are going. So we highlighted that as a gap that needs to be addressed in the implementation. While academia has been talking about this for the last 2 decades, there's not that much evidence of implementation except in a few water agencies across the country. And an exemplification of this is the Colorado River Compact, where interestingly, if you look on the left figure, what we see is that there is significant decadal variations or century scale variations in the flow available for the Colorado River, and water use increased monotonically through about the 1990s, and then since then has been constrained. But if you look at the US Bureau of Reclamation projections on the right-hand side, they project increasing water demand, in part due to migration of population to the area, and in part due to enhanced agricultural activity and warming, and hence more irrigation. Whereas the supply, in terms of their scenarios, is at best flat with a high degree of uncertainty. And what we see is that if these projections hold, then the demand would exceed supply. But it's an interesting figure that they have put out in this particular context, but it doesn't really emphasize the things that I was mentioning, which is, as you look on the left, there is significant decadal variability. If there was an opportunity to predict some of that, how would you start putting adaptation strategies in place that would be responsive to that? And that's an example of where the gap is in implementation. Okay, so I'm moving now to some regional examples. The regions are shown here. So we have the Northeast. As we move north, typically we are seeing more potential for extreme rainfall and flooding. And in the Southeast, we've been seeing similar things as well recently, but there have also been droughts. The Southern Great Plains, as I said earlier, the tendency is that in the southern part of the country, particularly away from the East Coast, we see evidence of enhancement of drought. And in the north, we see evidence of increases in rainfall or combination of droughts and rainfall as we go through. Some of these are related to variability such as El Nino or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the North Atlantic Oscillation, and some of these are anthropogenic. We can't systematically attribute individual events to climate change, but we can attribute trends to an extent to climate change. So that's something to keep in mind. And in the Midwest, again, we are seeing changing precipitation, flooding impact, and algal blooms as we looked at before. So basically, you will see the things that I mentioned earlier manifest in different regions of the country as we go through. So how are these showing up? And in some places that we want to highlight. So in island nations around the world and in islands in the United States, so for example, Hawaii, as sea level rises, we have saltwater intrusion, and with rising temperatures, we need more water use, and so people are doing more groundwater pumping because the opportunity in these locations to have surface water storage is limited. So as a result, they have compound factors that lead to water insecurity, and in some cases, what they are resorting to is increased desalination, which is energy intensive, and if the energy source is fossil fuel based, then you obviously are compounding the problem in a different way. So there's an example of that. In the Midwest, the featured example that we were talking about was what I mentioned earlier, the increases of surface water temperature leading to reduced dissolved oxygen in combination with algal blooms with more oxygen consumption. So these are just amplification of the ideas that I was putting out before. Similarly, the Pacific salmon populations are sensitive to temperature. They are sensitive to low stream flow in the summer, and so their populations are at risk as well with the changes that we are seeing. Again, this is a bit repetitive, as I said, but in the southern Great Plains, the illustration here is that in one county in Texas, the area planted for rice drops by 90%. The question is, should these people have been growing rice in the first place? But essentially the point is that they're going to have to shift away from some of the things they have been doing. Similarly, in the southeast, there were extreme storms in October 2015 that led to actually about 15 of the small dams that they had failed, and other impacts in the region. For example, the illustration here that Charleston is having to spend $235 million on improving drainage projects as they go through. So that's the summary of the national and some of the regional highlights. The citation to the chapter is here, and there's a link. And the team that worked together with us on presenting this is illustrated here. I won't read out all the names to save time. But all of these people were very interested in making sure that this time we focus on highlighting the intersection between the water sector and climate rather than regurgitating the climate impacts on the water sector, which has been the pattern in the past. So I would like to acknowledge them. And finally, the documents that we put together would not have been possible at all without Kristen and Eliza taking a clear role in shaping it and putting also together these slides. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Manu. If you have time, we have time for a couple of questions, if you don't mind. So Genevieve asks, is there any way to know if the recent flooding in the Midwest, Missouri River, etc., is connected to climate change?
So my answer on that is going to be no, and there will be many people in the climate community who will argue that I'm wrong. What I would say is that, as I said earlier, individual events are hard to attribute. There are people who attributed Hurricane Harvey as a very low probability event and hence attributed it to climate change. I think, in my view, it is still very difficult to do that because much of what we do with climate models is not robust with regard to reproducing persistent changes that we see because of decadal oscillations that are naturally there in the climate system, so even at this point. So the trends that we see, I think it's possible to attribute. There have been persistent rainfall events in the Midwest and persistent flooding in the past. The Mississippi River has several illustrations of that going back to 1837, actually. So I would say possible, but and probable, but not certain.
Thanks. And Sarah Green asks, does water supply include the Great Lakes? And if so, what % of the supply is in the lakes?
So water supply does include the Great Lakes. Typically what people do is that they think of water supply in terms of renewable supply, which is fluxes, versus stocks, which are things that are in storage. So changes in the water levels of the Great Lakes would represent fluxes, whereas the total volume of water that is there in the Great Lakes would represent stock. So mostly people who are interested in sustainability want to make sure that we are working with the renewable water supply and are not mining the stocks. And so that's the context that I would put there.
Great. And then one additional one for now, and then we can ask other questions at the end. Andy Gomkowski asks, have there been financial studies performed to show what effort would be required on a national level to combat either effects of climate change on water or cost of replacing aging infrastructure?
There are crude estimates. The American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Water Works Association, and other related groups talk about $1 trillion that are needed before 2030 to deal with aging water infrastructure. So what's interesting is that if you talk to Group A, they are talking about dams and levees, and they are not talking about the need induced by increasing risk due to climate change, just replacement of existing dams and levees. That's about at $1 trillion. Then if you look at water and wastewater systems that a different group looks at, they also come up with $1 trillion. So in the assessments that I've done, the aging water infrastructure story gets priced between $2 to $3 trillion that need to be spent between now and 2030 or 2040, somewhere in that time frame, not accounting for climate change. The critical infrastructure impacts that would result from the failure of this infrastructure, dams and levees specifically, this is unpriced at the moment. We've been trying to do that work in our group, trying to come up with a way to look at rapid assessment of failure of dams, specific every single dam in the country, and levees, and what that would impact. But it's been, our work has been unfunded, so it's been hard to actually make significant progress. We have done some work in New York so far, and what we see is that about 30 to 40% of the electrical generating capacity would be impacted if there were significant dam failures in the state of New York.
Great. Thank you so much. And if you have time to stay with us until the end, if any of our audience has questions that they come up with for Dr. Lall, we can hopefully cover those after Dr. Zamuda's presentation. So thank you so much, Manu. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, bye.
And Shannon, sure, and if we can switch over to the next slide deck. Thank you. Craig, are you ready?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I just jump in? Should I go ahead?
Please do. Yes.
Okay. So I want to thank both Shannon and Katie for sponsoring this event and the opportunity to speak to your audience today, and thank Manu for just an excellent presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be focusing my remarks on the energy chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment, and Dr. Lall's presentation here really set the stage because many of the vulnerabilities associated with the energy sector are associated with water, either too little water or too much water. So I think that's a nice segue into focusing on energy. I had the honor of being the lead author and the coordinating author for the energy chapter. There was a team effort. I'll talk about that team towards the end of the presentation. But to start off, I'm really going to provide some highlights of that chapter today and encourage you to pick that chapter up when you have the opportunity. As was indicated by Katie, the chapters cover multiple sectors and multiple regions of the country. Although I'm going to focus on energy, we should keep in mind that there's great interdependency between energy and many of these other national topics, whether we're talking about water, transportation, communication, health services, agriculture. We need power, reliable, affordable sources of power to be successful in these other sectors. And I'll finally note, even though I'll talk broadly about the energy sector, the NCA addresses many of the regions, the 10 regions, and I'll just simply note that there will be impacts on the energy sector. There are already impacts, and we expect those impacts to only increase in terms of frequency and magnitude across all regions of the country. It may vary from region to region, depending upon particular source of energy, et cetera, but no region of the country is immune from the impacts of climate change and extreme weather on the energy sector. The focus of our conversation today, the framework for the conversation today is really going to be around the 3 key messages. I'll provide just a few highlights here, and then the rest of the presentation will drill down in terms of these key messages. The first key message really focuses on the energy system vulnerability to extreme weather and climate. We are increasingly witnessing the impacts of extreme weather across all regions of the country, from hurricanes and storm surge damaging coastal energy infrastructure, to inland flooding impacting power plants, to droughts and wildfires impacting transmission and distribution systems in the Southwest, to extreme cold events associated with the polar vortex and the impacts on fuel supply and demand in the Midwest and Northeast. The annual damage cost associated with extreme weather impacts on the nation's energy system are estimated in tens of billions of dollars and are only projected to increase with a changing climate. The second key message really focuses on how the energy system itself is undergoing significant transformational change. Examples include increasing use of natural gas, replacing coal, the rapid deployment of renewable energy technologies, which are becoming more efficient, more cost effective. In addition, we're seeing increased deployment of distributed energy resources along with smart grid technologies, microgrids, distributed energy systems that can provide power, backup power, when the central power generation, transmission, and distribution systems are interrupted. And we're also witnessing the continuing increase in interdependencies between the energy sector and other critical infrastructure. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The third key message really focuses on how the nation is addressing these vulnerabilities and investing in enhanced resilience. Examples abound in terms of federal, state, local actions and those of the private sector, including physical hardening measures to protect energy assets from damage and planning activities to anticipate climate impacts and respond more effectively. So let's drill down in terms of these key messages, starting with the first. We're recognizing that already across the country that we're experiencing the impacts of extreme weather on the energy system. And given the greater interdependency across all these sectors, we're seeing how there's these potential cascading impacts. All components of the energy system may be impacted. The risk will vary across the energy sector, across the country. This figure, although it may be difficult to read here, this figure attempts to illustrate various risks to the different components of the energy system, from energy supply to energy demand. For example, warming temperatures and heat waves will increase energy demand, at the same time impacting energy supply. The grid will face more blackouts. Power plants may need to shut down due to lower water levels and elevated cooling water temperatures. Sea level rise, more intense storms and flooding will damage energy assets from generation to transmission and distribution assets. Droughts can impact not only hydropower, but water availability for thermoelectric generation, as well as oil and gas refining operations and biofuel production. The magnitude, duration, and frequency of these risks will vary geographically, and the chapter provides numerous examples of current and projected impacts to the energy sector. I'll just briefly talk about the costs of these impacts. There's many ways to measure various costs to damages, to power interruptions, etc. For example, if you look at recent cost estimates of power interruptions, we can see estimates that vary from $25 to $70 billion annually. This does not include the cost of damages from major low-frequency, high-impact events such as recent hurricanes or wildfires. This is the more routine blue sky events where we're losing power. So when you add on the cost of these major events, that annual price tag is only going up. Thus, while investments in resilience have a cost as well, we're already experiencing a significant cost under a business-as-usual approach of wait for the damages to occur and then repair and replace using a similar design. Many recent studies have demonstrated a positive return on investment for resilience investments. For example, an assessment of FEMA mitigation grants in terms of post-disaster recovery investments concluded that mitigation saves money with benefits that greatly exceed the cost. For example, for every dollar spent on pre-event mitigation, $4 was calculated to be saved in post-event damages. So, said in a simpler way, you either pay now or we pay more later. With regards to additional impacts beyond just damages, we can see that climate change is projected to increase demand for cooling due to higher temperatures, while also lowering the heating demand in many locations. However, the reduced heating demand would not be enough to offset higher energy demand for cooling and the greater use of air conditioner use and cooling equipment. So the costs will actually increase. Estimates suggest that residential and commercial electricity expenditures by mid-century will increase by as much as $30 billion annually under a greenhouse gas emission scenario of 8.5. Despite anticipated gains in energy in use, building and appliance efficiencies, higher temperatures are projected to drive up electricity costs not only by increasing demand, but also reducing efficiency of power generation and distribution. Studies suggest that rising temperatures could require construction of up to 25% more power plant capacity in the U.S. by 2040 than would be necessary without a warming climate. Given our focus today on water, I should also note that the energy system is very water intensive. Water is used for fuel production and transport, for hydropower, biofuel feedstocks. Significant volumes of water are used for thermoelectric power generation. In some cases, a plant would need to shut down due to lack of water availability or elevated water temperatures that are projected to occur in this country. Estimators project that the output of power plants cooled by river water could fall by more than 13% due to warming temperatures by mid-century. So moving on to the second key message, in terms of fuel sources, really the second key message really talks about not changes in climate, but changes in the energy system itself that are taking place. And those changes may result in increased or decreased vulnerabilities. We see from this upper figure the significant changes taking place just over the last few years. For example, in 2016, for the first time, natural gas replaced coal as the leading source for electricity generation in the U.S. To put it in perspective, EIA reports that in 2009, coal generated roughly 46% of U.S. electricity. By 2018, coal generated around 28% of U.S. electricity. While coal use has been diminishing, generating electricity with natural gas has been growing. In 2009, natural gas generated about 22% of U.S. electricity. By 2018, it was up to over 35% of U.S. electricity. So we see changes taking place not just in switching from coal to natural gas, but increased growth and deployment of renewable generation sources. For example, in 2016, solar energy grew by 19%, wind grew by 19%. Still relatively a small number, but a number that's increasing significantly with improvements in cost and efficiency. The lower figure in this helps illustrate these interdependencies I was talking about between electricity and other sectors. Risk management practices must take these interdependencies into account to holistically, effectively manage risks. For example, enhanced communication technologies, including a smarter grid, provides operators with real-time information to detect, isolate, and address outages more efficiently. However, without appropriate preventative measures, these system changes are expected to increase vulnerability to cyber attack, thereby reducing resilience, potentially reducing overall resilience. So on one hand, you could increase resilience to extreme weather. On the other hand, you could create additional vulnerabilities to other threats to the system. Superstorm Sandy helped to illustrate interdependencies across sectors. For example, we witnessed cascading impacts with gasoline stations unable to pump gas due to loss of electricity. Other examples included mass transit that had to close down because of loss of electricity, healthcare facilities scrambling to keep power, wastewater treatment plants dumping billions of gallons of raw sewage into the nation's waterways. So this increasing interdependency between the electricity sector and these other sectors results in these cross-cutting increases in vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. And finally, with regards to the third key message, actions that are underway to enhance resilience, there are significant actions that are taking place today, both in terms of improved modeling to project future climate conditions at a useful granularity for local decision making, enhanced vulnerability assessment planning taking place to characterize the risks and develop cost-effective resilience strategies, establishment of public-private partnerships to assist in developing and deploying resilient solutions. The Department of Energy, for example, established a partnership for energy sector climate resilience with a number of utilities across the country to help facilitate sharing of best practices, help develop methodologies for conducting vulnerability assessments, help make the business case for resilience investment, etc. So just one of many public-private partnerships that are helping to accelerate the investments in resilience. In addition, we have innovations in energy technologies. The technologies that are largely deployed today, many of them have lifespans that are on the order of decades, so they're really designed several decades ago. We need to look at the threats that infrastructure will be facing in the future decades rather than looking at just continuing to employ designs that were based on conditions that we've moved beyond from the last century. When we look at energy assets, for example, many of these things have lifespans of several decades. Median age of an existing coal plant is about 47 years old. New plants have to be resilient, not just for today, but into the future. And the design and construction of these resilient solutions should also be looking at the lifespan of these assets, and where appropriate, using an adaptive design, where, for example, the design and construction of a flood wall could be done in a manner that allows expansion over time. So raising that over time. So if the information is suggesting when you look over the next 10 or 10 years, certain projections of rising sea level, rising floodwaters, but those waters may be rising even more in the outer years, mid-century and beyond. Using an adaptive design could allow you to build in resilience as the threat increases over time. Bottom line, we're making investments to enhance resilience, and we're witnessing the return of those investments. However, given the magnitude of the challenge, I think we all recognize the pace, scale, and scope of these actions will need to be enhanced, which takes me to kind of a key takeaways and kind of a final slide here. Point one is we know in summary that extreme weather events are already impacting the energy sector, resulting in annual costs in the billions. The current pace is inadequate given the nature of the challenge. Point two, there is a need for us to take action, not just with regards to adaptation, but with regards to mitigation. I think John Holgren, the former director of OSTP, stated it best. We have a choice: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required, and the less suffering there will be. So we will need to do adaptation, but the amount will be a function of how aggressive we pursue mitigation strategies. There are several key barriers that I wanted to focus on before we conclude. One, that resilience investment decisions are local decisions. We need to be able to provide downscaled climate information that address those associated uncertainties and provide planners with sufficient information to move forward. Second point is we have no accepted methodology for really characterizing the benefits of resilience. For example, in the electricity sector, the focus is typically on the benefits to the utility or the ratepayer or customer. But what about benefits to society by having a more reliable, resilient energy system? And what about the co-benefits? Not just the direct benefits, but the co-benefits. Benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions through, say, the use of renewable energy resources. Benefits from a safety perspective, et cetera. These indirect benefits are typically not included in the regulatory decision-making process, but may actually exceed the direct benefits. And so we need to do a better job of coming up with a methodology that fully accounts for not just all the costs, but all the benefits. We have few, if any, resilience design codes and standards for the energy sector, for that matter, across all sectors. How do we build back better after disaster, or for that matter, build a more resilient energy system in the absence of design codes and standards? And finally, I guess in terms of barriers, we do not have an enabling policy framework that really incentivizes investments in resilience. For example, at the federal level, we provide tax credits to encourage many types of investments in the energy sector, addressing carbon capture and storage, addressing energy efficiency, addressing the deployment of certain energy technologies like wind and solar. But we have few, if any, tax incentives to accelerate resilience investments. And I'll conclude on kind of the final point here. There's many opportunities. Opportunities not only to expand efforts to better characterize vulnerabilities at the local level, not just vulnerabilities, looking at past projections, looking at kind of historic trends, but looking at future trends in terms of what climate will do in terms of flooding, temperatures, wind, et cetera, into the future, and having those vulnerability assessments fully embrace those future risks. We need to continue to develop innovative energy technologies and drive those costs down. We need standardized methods and metrics to measure vulnerabilities and the effectiveness of current resilience solutions and investments. In essence, we need to collect and share infrastructure damage and cost data after extreme weather events to better assess the cost effectiveness of these resilience measures. We don't currently do that really at a national, state, or even the local level to kind of pull that information together. So we're making significant investments. We're not really doing an adequate job of characterizing the benefits from those investments. I guess finally, we're all going to be impacted, and we all have a role to play, and we should be identifying opportunities for us collectively, both through public-private partnerships, to enhance the collaboration that's going on at the federal, state, and local levels, and both at the public and private sector level. Let me end on a note of acknowledgement and thanks to the team that really pulled this chapter, the energy chapter, together and provided the feedstock for today's presentation. And then finally, for anybody that would like additional information, I've included here both the final citation here is for the energy chapter, but there are a few other examples of reports that we've generated at the Department of Energy that looks at climate change and extreme weather and looks at vulnerabilities as well as resilience solutions across the country and a regional level. So please avail yourself of those resources, and if you'd like to follow up with me, I would welcome that. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. It looks like somebody's typing right now, and so here we go. Eric asks, can you talk a bit about any cooperative planning across levels of government, particularly federal agency and local government, that's taking place?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of examples that we could talk to. Let me just focus on one, because it's currently, even though I'm with the Department of Energy, I am on detail to FEMA for the summer, and working with them in their public assistance programs that many of you may be aware of. But the short story is, after a major declared event, natural disaster, FEMA has funding to help build back, and so there's a major effort underway to really look at what does build back better mean now that FEMA has authority to not just build it back the way it was, but to build it back better. And so there's efforts underway right now, for example, to look at what are the codes and standards we have out there for building a more resilient system, not just with regards to energy, but across all sectors. And so there's an opportunity for collaboration between folks at the federal level, state level, local level, and for that matter, the private sector, to come together and define at the operational level what resilience means. How should we be building back? What level of risk reduction are we willing to fund? So that's an excellent example. FEMA actually will be coming out with an interim policy in the next few months that is an outgrowth of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. But I think this is just a beginning in terms of efforts to enhance resilience across all sectors, including the energy sector, and to do that in a very descriptive manner in terms of really just trying to define from a design standard basis what enhanced resilience should look like.
Thanks so much. And Dave Reed-Miller just shared a link in the chat box as well for the Climate Resilience Toolkit that has a lot of examples of local community level action. So it looks like some folks are still typing, but I would just like to take a second. Oh, here we go. I will defer. Andy asks, has there been any consideration on a national level for education in the trades specific to the class of worker needed for the significant resiliency build occurring across the nation, like linemen, electricians, etc.? It seems that the money is there, the planning and engineering is ongoing, but one of the pinch points is qualified talent to perform the work.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there's a significant body of information out there. But the challenge is making sure that that information gets in the right hands. And, you know, in essence, one could argue that everybody has a role to play in terms of resilience. There's perhaps comparable roles across both the federal government, state level, local level, and a role in the private sector. I think the challenge is there are examples of things that are going on today to better educate, better train workers, but I'd say it's a work in progress. And given the awareness that folks have in this country in terms of risks, that there's lots of room for improvement. This is probably an area that should receive greater priority. I think typically our response to these disasters is one that, you know, we wait for the damage to occur and then we address it rather than having a much more preventative approach. And I think to make that shift from a post-disaster response to a pre-disaster planning approach, we're going to need to both increase the awareness of folks across the country, as well as to get to your point, even for those that are directly responsible for addressing resilience. We need better sharing of best practices there. In many cases, the needs we have cut across the entire country. Although the specific risks may vary in terms of priority, there's just some fundamental needs that we have. And starting with just the climate science information to be using that's downscaled to the local level that addresses the uncertainties of these projections. And I know that there's efforts, I think David Reed-Miller's point about the Climate Resilience Toolkit, there are efforts to provide kind of a foundation of information, both with regards to climate science, and clearly, you know, the NCA4, the science report, as well as this report we're talking about today, provides an excellent foundation of information. But there's tools that we can use, at least at the federal level, to do a better job of disseminating information to help in training programs, et cetera. So this unfortunately is one of those areas where, kind of going back to my earlier comment about the energy sector, there are significant investments taking place, but we need to do a better job, not just from a technology resilience perspective, but across all these different components that are necessary, the ability to better characterize the vulnerabilities, the ability to better characterize and make the business case for these investments. There's lots of information that could be made available, and we just need to do a better job of highlighting what we have at the federal level, and to encourage the state and local reps to do a better job when they've invested in this area, whether it's in training or developing local codes and standards, or any of these other tools that are going to be necessary, of recognizing that this isn't an exercise that is going to be addressed over the next few years. This is something that's going to be with us through our lifetimes, and we need to do a better job of institutionalizing and making people aware of the various tools and information that's available.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. So we still have both of our presenters, and we have a couple more minutes if somebody has a question for either one of them. But I really just want to take a second to thank both of you, Dr. Lall and Dr. Zamuda. We really appreciate your time and all of the efforts that you made on the development of the 4th National Climate Assessment. For reference for folks on the phone or on the line, both of these chapters can be read in full at nca2018.globalchange.gov. We can drop that back in the chat box too. We've also developed a number of downloadable materials that could be useful. That includes the overview to the report, chapter executive summaries. We have the figures pulled out, and then we even have chapter-specific PowerPoint files for those of you who might find those useful. And Dave just shared the link to that as well. Okay, so we have a few thank yous in here, so thank you again, Craig and Manu. This was really fantastic, and I hope that everyone on the line will consider joining us next week for the 3rd seminar in our series that's going to cover land cover, land use change, and forests, and those findings from the assessment, and that will be with Jim Wickham from EPA, Jim Vos from the Forest Service, and Dave Peterson from the University of Washington. So that should be another great presentation. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope, yes, and then Shannon just shared the link. So please email tracy.gill@noaa.gov if you want to be added to the weekly science seminar email list. That'll include the remainder of the sessions that we have set up for you all summer long, and a whole bunch of other really great webinars. Thank you so much, and have a great day.